Two skeletons, buried side by side, 1,400 years old. Their hands are still locked together. For years, this grave was called one of the most romantic discoveries in archaeology. A husband and wife reunited in death, holding on to each other for eternity. News outlets ran the story. Tourists came to see it. Then, in 2019, a team of scientists opened up their teeth. Not to check for cavities, to read a protein. Tooth enamel holds a molecule called amylogenin. It comes in two slightly different versions, one written on the X chromosome, one on the Y. Which version shows up in your teeth tells scientists your biological sex, even after 14 centuries in the ground. The results came back. Both skeletons had the male version. The hand-holding lovers were both men. We'll come back to them, because this isn't the only famous couple in the archaeological record that turned out not to be what everyone assumed. There's another one. Buried in Iran, nearly 3,000 years old, locked in what looks unmistakably like a final kiss. It has its own twist, and we're saving it. Here's the real question underneath all of it. Did ancient humans actually pair up for life? One partner? One bond? Until death? The way we picture a soulmate? The way a lot of us assume love worked before written history? Or is that image something we invented? Projected backward onto skeletons that can't argue with us? The evidence, genetic, skeletal, and drawn from thousands of years of human burial sites, tells a much stranger, more specific story than either monogamous forever or promiscuous free-for-all. It says something about why humans bond at all, and it says something about us right now in the 21st century, whether we're married, dating, or somewhere in between. To get there, we need to go back roughly 50,000 years, into small groups of people who left almost no writing, no legends, nothing, except their bones, their teeth, and buried inside every cell of those bones, their DNA. That's where the actual evidence lives, and it's about to complicate everything you assumed about ancient love. Start with a basic biological problem, because it explains everything that follows. Human babies are born broken, in a sense. Not literally, but compared to almost every other primate, a human infant enters the world helpless. It can't cling to its mother's fur. It can't walk. It can't even hold its own head up. A baby chimpanzee is riding around on its mother within days. A human baby needs years, actual years, before it can look after itself even a little. Why? Because the human brain got big. Too big to finish developing inside the womb without killing the mother during birth. So evolution struck a compromise. Human babies are born early, relative to their development, and finish cooking outside the body, over a period of intense, extended dependency. That single fact rewired human relationships. A mother trying to keep a slow-growing, high-maintenance infant alive, while pregnant again, while gathering food, while avoiding is in serious trouble without help. So the question becomes, where does the help come from? This is the setup for what anthropologists call pair bonding, a real, measurable, evolved behavior. Not a fairy tale. An attachment system built into the brain that produces mate guarding, shared food, shared shelter, and, critically, some form of paternal involvement in raising the child. But notice what that setup does not require. It doesn't require the bond to last a lifetime. It only requires the bond to last long enough to get one dependent child through its most dangerous years. That distinction, a bond built for a purpose, not a bond built to be permanent, is going to matter for the rest of this story. So here's the first real curiosity gap. If pair bonding evolved to solve a childcare problem, not a forever love problem, what actually determined whether ancient couples stayed together? The answer starts with the oldest population we can test directly, the Neanderthals. In 2022, a team led by geneticist Laurits Skov, working with Svante Pääbo, the scientist who first sequenced Neanderthal DNA, extracted genetic material from 13 individuals found in two caves in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, Chagirskaya and Okladnikov. The bones were around 54,000 years old. What they found looked at first like an ordinary family. A father, his teenage daughter, a young boy and an adult woman who turned out to be second-degree relatives, something like an aunt and nephew or a grandmother and grandchild. A family. Buried or at least gathered together. Here's where it gets interesting. When the team compared two different kinds of DNA, mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from mother to child, and Y chromosome DNA, which passes only from father to son, they found something lopsided. The mitochondrial DNA was far more diverse than the Y chromosome DNA. What does that mean in plain terms? It means the men in this group were, genetically, all closely related to each other. The women were not related to each other at all. In other words, the men stayed. The women arrived from somewhere else. This is a pattern anthropologists call patrilocality. Sons remain in the community they were born into for their entire lives, while daughters leave to find partners in other bands, and unfamiliar women arrive to become the new mothers of the group. A separate discovery in a cave called El Cedron in northern Spain confirmed the same pattern with even sharper precision. 12 Neanderthals, 3 adult men, 3 adult women, and several children were analyzed by Carles Lalueza Fox and his team. All 3 adult men carried the exact same maternal genetic lineage. All 3 adult women carried 3 completely different ones. Picture what that means on the ground. 3 men who grew up together, in the same small cave system, surrounded by the same relatives their entire lives. 3 women, each arriving from a different, unrelated group, each leaving behind her own mother, her own childhood cave, to join this one. So, did these Neanderthals mate for life? Here's what the evidence actually supports, and where it stops. The genetics prove long-term social structure. They prove that once a woman arrived in a group, she stayed, raised children there, and was buried there. That is a form of stability, reproductive stability at minimum. But the DNA cannot tell us whether that father and that daughter's mother were still together when she died. It cannot tell us whether Neanderthal men took a single partner or more than one. It cannot record affection, exclusivity, or duration. It can only tell us who moved and who stayed. There's a colder detail buried in the El Cedron findings, too. The bones of all 12 individuals showed cut marks, evidence of cannibalism, likely from another group, shortly before their remains were swept into the cave system. Whatever bonds existed inside that family, they ended in violence, not old age. So the first population we can actually test doesn't give us lifelong monogamy or no bonds at all. It gives us something more specific, small, tight-knit bands held together by male kinship, sustained generation after generation by women who left their own families behind to join them. That raises the next question immediately. If men never left and women constantly arrived from outside, where were all these outside women coming from? How did a small band of 10 or 20 people, isolated in the mountains, keep finding new partners without eventually running out of options, or running into their own relatives? That question takes us to a different site, a different species of human, and one of the most remarkable burials ever excavated. 34,000 years ago, in what's now central Russia, a community buried an adult man in a grave covered in red ochre and sewn with more than 3,000 mammoth ivory beads. Beads that, based on experimental replication, would have taken thousands of hours to carve. Nearby, in a second grave, 2 teenagers were buried head to head, covered in even more ivory, over 10,000 beads between the 2 graves combined. Spears made of straightened mammoth tusk lay beside them. This is Sunghir. And for a long time, the assumption was simple. These must be a family. A father buried in one grave, his 2 children buried together in another. Geneticist Martin Sikora and his team sequenced the genomes to check. The results overturned the assumption. The 2 teenagers were not siblings. They weren't first cousins. They weren't even related to each other up to the 3rd degree of kinship. Despite sharing the same rare Y chromosome and mitochondrial lineages as the adult man in the neighboring grave. Think about how strange that is. 2 boys buried together with equal ceremony, wrapped in identical extraordinary wealth, treated by their community as equals in death, and they weren't blood relatives at all. What does that tell us? It tells us this community was not an isolated, inbred pocket of survivors. It was plugged into something much larger, a regional network of unrelated groups, deliberately exchanging partners across long distances, specifically to avoid inbreeding. This matters because it answers the question the Neanderthal evidence left open. Small hunter-gatherer bands of 10 or 20 people cannot survive genetically in isolation. Sung here shows the solution: an entire system spanning many separate communities built for one purpose, keeping the gene pool wide enough that people almost never had to pair with a close relative. Which means something else too. If people were being deliberately connected to partners outside their own small group, then finding a mate wasn't left to chance encounters in the forest. It was in some form socially organized. Bonds weren't private accidents. They were embedded in a network that the whole community had a stake in maintaining. But organized mate exchange isn't the same as romantic commitment. A network that connects you to a partner says nothing about whether you stay with that partner for 2 years or 50. For that, we need a different kind of evidence. Not a network, not a family tree. A single grave from a moment 14,000 years ago that looks less like a genetic puzzle and more like an actual relationship. 14,000 years ago, at a site now called Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, someone buried a man in his late 30s or 40s and a woman in her mid-20s, together, in a single grave. They weren't alone. Beside them lay the skeleton of a young dog, one of the oldest confirmed domesticated dogs ever found. Pathology on its bones shows it had been desperately sick, likely with a canine illness that would have killed it without weeks of intensive human care. Feeding it, keeping it warm, nursing it through a disease it had no chance of surviving on its own. Someone chose to keep that dog alive. And when it eventually died, someone chose to bury it with these two people. Along with carved antler art and a decorated bone ornament, all covered in the same red ochre used to mark the most significant burials of the era. This is the Ice Age ending, the last brutal stretch of the glacial maximum, right before the climate began to warm. And in the middle of that hard, cold world, this community made a deliberate choice. This man, this woman, and this animal belonged together, and they wanted the afterlife, whatever they believed it to know it. Here's the honest limit of what this proves. We cannot know if this man and woman were lifelong partners. We cannot know if they died on the same day from the same cause: disease, exposure, an accident, which is, statistically, the most common reason two adults end up in a single grave together. Simultaneous death, not simultaneous choice. But what we can say is this: their community recognized them as a paired unit, worth the same ochre, worth the same grave, worth the same dying dog, kept alive against the odds, and buried at their side. That's real evidence of social pair bonding. Not a guess, not a myth. Somewhere between the cold genetics of the Neanderthal caves and the warm assumption of eternal love, there's this: two people, a dying dog somebody chose to save, and a community that buried them as one. So bonds were real. They were valued. They were marked ritually as meaningful, which makes the next chapter even stranger, because everything changes all at once about 10,000 years ago, the moment humans stop following animals and start planting seeds. For the entire span of human existence up to this point, hundreds of thousands of years, nobody owned land. You couldn't inherit a field, because there were no fields. Wealth couldn't accumulate across generations, because there was almost nothing to accumulate. It's hard to hoard when everything you own has to be carried on your back. Then agriculture arrived, and for the first time, a family could hold on to something valuable: land, grain stores, livestock, and pass it down. That single change rewrote the mating landscape of an entire species. Start in France, at a Neolithic cemetery called Gergy-les-Noisats, roughly 4,800 years before the current era. A team led by Maite Rivolat sequenced DNA from over 100 individuals, enough to reconstruct not just a family, but two entire family trees, spanning 7 generations. 7 generations, reconstructed from teeth and bone. That's an almost unbelievable resolution into a community's private life. And the pattern is unmistakable. The male line stays rooted in place, generation after generation, on the same land, in the same community. The women are the outsiders, again and again across 7 generations. It's foreign-born women marrying into the local male lineage, not the other way around. This looks, on the surface, exactly like the Neanderthal pattern from 50,000 years earlier. Men stay, women arrive. But there's a difference buried in the data, something the Neanderthal caves couldn't show us because their sample sizes were too small. Scattered through those 7 generations, the pedigree contains children whose biological father does not match the man they were raised by. Extra-pair paternity. A child, growing up inside a stable, recognized household, fathered, genetically, by someone outside that household. This is important and worth sitting with. It means that even in a settled, land-owning, multi-generational farming community, the kind of society we'd assume had the most reason to enforce strict fidelity, social marriage and genetic exclusivity were already 2 different things. The household could be stable, the pairing could be recognized, permanent, functional, and it still wasn't always sexually exclusive. That's one thread. Here's the second, and it's darker. Somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, population geneticists studying Y chromosome diversity across Europe, Asia, and Africa found something that looks, at first glance, like an error in the data. Mitochondrial DNA diversity, tracing maternal lines, stayed roughly normal, but Y chromosome diversity, tracing paternal lines, collapsed severely. Some estimates put the ratio as extreme as 17 reproducing women for every 1 reproducing man, across entire regions. That is not a modest shift toward polygamy. That's a near-total reproductive monopoly held by a small number of men at a continental scale. What caused it? The leading explanation ties directly back to the invention of inheritable wealth. Once land, cattle, and stored grain could be passed down a bloodline, a small number of elite men, the heads of powerful patrilineal clans, could accumulate enough wealth to support multiple wives simultaneously, while other men with no land and no inheritance were locked out of reproduction almost entirely. Some researchers add another layer: warfare between rival patrilineal clans, where the winning lineage didn't just take territory, it took reproductive access, while losing lineages were wiped out, taking their Y chromosome lines down with them. So think about what just happened across this chapter. For hundreds of thousands of years, pair bonding functioned as a relatively balanced system. One partner helping raise one set of dependent offspring, embedded in a wider exogamous network that kept things genetically healthy. Agriculture didn't invent pair bonding. It didn't invent monogamy either. What it invented was inequality, the ability of a small number of powerful men to opt out of pairing altogether and monopolize multiple partners at once, while most other men were pushed toward little or no reproduction. This is the part of the story that reframes everything that came before it. The traditional image of one wife, one husband, one household, locked in by property, marriage law, inheritance, isn't actually the ancient baseline. It's a correction. A pushback against an even more unequal system that agriculture briefly made possible, which brings us back, finally, to the hands that wouldn't let go, and to the other famous couple we set aside at the very beginning. Now the second couple. Iran, roughly 2,800 years ago, at a site called Tepe Hassanlu, 2 skeletons discovered in 1972 inside a storage bin, arranged as if one were reaching out to touch the other's face in a final gesture. A pose so tender it earned the nickname the Hassanlu kiss. For decades, it was assumed to be a man and a woman, husband and wife, caught together in the citywide destruction that killed them both by fire and collapse. In 2017, researchers Paige Selinsky and Janet Monge re-examined the skeletons using pelvic anatomy and DNA. Both individuals were male. 2 hand-holding lovers from 2 different centuries, 2 different countries. Both turned out to be male pairs. Likely comrades, possibly brothers or kin, caught in violent destruction and, in their final moment, reaching for each other for whatever comfort was left to find. There's a third case. Gentler and sadder in a different way. The Lovers of Valdaro, a Neolithic burial near Mantua, Italy. 2 skeletons locked in a face-to-face embrace, arms and legs intertwined. This pair really was male and female. But when researchers examined the bones, both individuals were under 20 years old. Whatever this was, and it may well have been love, it wasn't decades of shared life. It was almost certainly 2 very young people who died together, probably from the same sudden cause, and were arranged in that embrace by the people who buried them. Here's why all 3 of these cases matter, beyond the individual mysteries. Every one of them was originally read the same way. Hands together in death must mean love sustained across a lifetime. And in every single case, the deeper evidence complicated that story. Two were misread on gender entirely. One was misread on age and duration. Every iconic ancient couple the modern world fell in love with turned out to be evidence of something else. Companionship, grief, chance, crisis, layered under an assumption that turned out to be ours, not theirs. That's not a debunking for its own sake. It's the same lesson the entire investigation has been building toward, chapter by chapter, since we stood in that Siberian cave. So, did ancient humans mate for life? Look at what the full weight of the evidence actually shows, instead of the myth. Return to the closest living comparison we have. Modern hunter-gatherer societies like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Ache of Paraguay tracked in detailed demographic studies across entire lifetimes. Among the Hadza, divorce is not rare. Researchers measure it in the range of 49 to 64 divorces per 1,000 marriage years. Women in these societies average somewhere between roughly 2 and 2.5 spouses across a lifetime, not one. And notably, polygyny, one man, multiple wives, is actually uncommon among foragers, hovering around 4% among the Hadza, simply because there's no storable wealth for an ordinary man to use to attract or support a second family. That kind of imbalance required agriculture and inheritance to become possible at scale. Put all 7 chapters together, and a specific evidence-based picture emerges, very different from either extreme. Ancient humans were not naturally monogamous for life, locked into single lifelong pairs the way popular imagination often assumes. But ancient humans were also not living in some formless, bond-free promiscuity either. The evidence points somewhere much more specific and honestly, more human. Serial monogamy. Real bonds. Bonds strong enough to reshape brain chemistry, strong enough to motivate one partner to provision another through the hardest years of raising a dependent child, strong enough that entire communities marked those bonds with grave goods, ochre, and ceremony. Just not bonds guaranteed to last a lifetime. Bonds that ended through death, through separation, through simple incompatibility, and were quite often formed again with someone new. That serial pattern doesn't stop at the edge of prehistory. It's sitting in plain sight in the United States right now. Something close to 4 to 5 out of every 10 first marriages in the US still end in divorce. Long-term cohabitation outside of formal marriage has surged among young adults, rising nearly 100-fold among 18 to 24-year-olds between 1968 and 2018. People increasingly form a real committed partnership and then, sometimes, form another one. It can look, from a distance, like modern life abandoning some ancient standard of permanent commitment. The evidence suggests almost the opposite. It looks like a return back past the rigid, property-driven, elite-controlled marriage systems that agriculture and inheritance built, back towards something closer to what pair bonding actually was for most of human history. Real, meaningful, cooperative, and not guaranteed to be forever. So think again about those interlocked hands from Modena. Not a myth about eternal heterosexual romance. That part was never true, but not nothing either. 2 people, likely comrades, choosing to hold on to each other as everything around them ended. Maybe that's the more accurate portrait of ancient love, and maybe of love generally. Not a promise carved in stone to last forever. Just 2 people in whatever time they actually had, choosing not to let go.